So Jefferson wrote that he was concerned in his writings, he was very concerned about how abused and poverty ridden freed slaves were in his lifetime. It's because they lacked an education. So if you're uneducated and somebody de facto gives you your freedom, your liberty, but you can't support yourself, you're going to be taken advantage of.
Welcome to the KUBIK Report podcast. Today I am pleased to share my 32nd podcast with Greg Thomas. He is a business leader, author, keynote speaker, and a personal life coach. His clients range from large Fortune 100 corporations down to small family-owned businesses. To learn more about his YouTube site, simply type in Leadership Excellence channel on the YouTube homepage search bar, and you will find him. So, Greg, welcome back to the KUBIK Report.
Vic, I'm glad to be here and glad to talk a little bit more about Thomas Jefferson and maybe what some people consider to be some of the more unsavory parts of his life. We're going to tackle these issues head on, and we're going to have a frank and honest discussion, not only about his strengths, but some of his weaknesses.
So, we have started this podcast series on leadership lessons of the American founding fathers in honor of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence this year. And by the way, this is being recorded within a few days now, just of that 250th anniversary of July 4th, 2026. We began with George Washington, then explored the life of John Adams, and now we will have part 2 on the American founder, Thomas Jefferson. So, Greg, in surveying Jefferson's life, what were the major accomplishments and leadership qualities of Jefferson?
Well, we'll go through this quickly, Vic, because we really touched upon these in part 1. So we'll go through them rather quickly. He, of course, is the principal author of the Declaration of Independence of 1776 and one of the most important founding fathers. And that is the most important founding document in U.S. history. And that's why we will all be celebrating that 250th anniversary shortly. He helped establish religious freedom in Virginia by writing a statute that became law in 1786. And we all enjoy the benefits of the founders who, because they were so diverse religiously, insisted on religious freedom in the United States. And we're so thankful that they had the courage to do that. He served as the first Secretary of State under George Washington. He helped shape the new nation's early government, foreign policy. He became the third president of the United States. He served from 1801 to 1809, 2 terms. Following Washington's example, he stepped down after 2 terms. He oversaw the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, which nearly doubled the size of the United States. He authorized the Lewis and Clark expedition to explore the Western lands. He helped promote the idea of limited federal government, and we're still struggling with that issue 250 years later, right? We all struggle with how big and powerful should the federal government be compared to our individual state governments. Remember, the authors of the Constitution on purpose have dual sovereignty. Their thought was, if we give certain rights to the states and certain rights to the federal government, they're kind of like in competition with each other. And while they're competing with each other, they're not oppressing us. So they thought that would be a healthy form of conflict, and we still struggle with that today.
Right.
He worked to reduce the national debt during his presidency. He was successful in doing that. He founded and designed the University of Virginia in 1819. He also drafted important political writings, such as a summary view of the rights of British America that had an influential impact on the Continental Congress and actually led to him being asked to write the Declaration. He wrote the Kentucky Resolution while vice president, which basically condemned the Alien and Sedition Act, which he didn't agree with. And he established a Virginia presidential dynasty. He was a Federalist, and we've talked about what that meant in the past. He was succeeded by James Madison, who was also from Virginia. He served 2 terms. He was followed by James Monroe, who also was from Virginia, and he served 2 terms. And Thomas Jefferson was the mentor to both Madison and Monroe. So he left a legacy of preceding generations because he was such a great coach and mentor and was so respected during his time.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's very good to have that background. You said more there than you even did in the first one. So I'm glad to have those additional points brought out because he truly was a great man. And as we said earlier, he was your favorite of the early founding fathers, and same thing with me. So, Greg, Jefferson's reputation has been tarnished recently because, as a great proponent of freedom, writing on the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, yet he continued to be a slave owner. Why do you think this was?
Well, I think there's some merit to the criticism. He enslaved more than 600 people over the course of his life among his various plantations. And like the founding of the country and the other founding fathers, his life remains central for us to understand both the ideals and the contradictions of the early United States. I believe in everything I've read about him and his own writings that he seriously tried to eliminate slavery early in his career, but over time, he just became very frustrated and he gave up and came to the conclusion that it's not going to happen in my generation, but it absolutely will happen in the future. And I'll give you some examples of that, why I believe that. Most of the draft articles that were removed in the Declaration of Independence by the Continental Congress, most of what was eliminated of his draft was his criticism about King George bringing slaves to the colony.
Mm-hmm.
It bothered the Southern representatives because it talked about slavery openly, but he was trying to imply very strongly in that slavery was wrong, that it was a national sin. That was all cut out of his draft resolution. However, as clever as he was, he did slip in a time bomb that he knew would explode in the next generation. Here's the time bomb. Quote, this got through the censors.
Mm-hmm.
This got through first the committee, which included Adams and Franklin and others, and then it got through the Continental Congress. This remains. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that was a time bomb. And because that was left in there, the next generation was going to have to wrestle with the fact that we were not living up to the ideals of that declaration. So he was a man of contradictions, like most people are. How can Jefferson and the founding be vindicated against this base charge of hypocrisy regarding slavery?
Mm-hmm.
Well, again, I want to mention that most people don't realize that in 1777, when he's a member of the Virginia House of Delegates, that he proposed an emancipation proposal in Virginia to eventually free the slaves. Uh, Obviously, he was mocked by his fellow plantation owners in the Congress, completely shut down. It never became law, but you have to give him credit for trying. That's something that early on in his life he was very serious about and really wanted to eliminate slavery. But as he grew older, he came to see that it just was not time. It just was not going to happen. Another thing that I think most people forget when they criticize the founders is the Declaration of Independence states that governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed. Well, slavery was legal in all 13 colonies. So, how could these representatives outlaw slavery without the consent of the people from their states? To do that would have delegitimized the Declaration itself because they would have done that against the consent of the governed. Most people accepted slavery as a given. After all, it's been going on for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. It isn't until 25 years later, after 1800, that sovereign nations even began outlawing slavery, beginning in Haiti in 1804. They were the first sovereign nation. The majority of the residents were African origin, and they had a riot and they overcame the French and they outlawed slavery in 1804. So to judge the founders for not being the first nation to ever outlaw slavery after it's been given for thousands and thousands of years is not only rather naive, but to my mind, in my opinion, it's extremely self-righteous. You should not judge previous generations by how you view the world today. And I can tell you this, the next generation, how are they going to judge us? Well, they're probably going to condemn us for eating meat. How barbaric that you would have eaten animals. They most likely are going to condemn us for abortion because we have a population collapse occurring in most modern nations from Japan throughout Europe, North America, and our way of life is totally going to be eroded because there are not enough people being born to support these safety social nets, to pay taxes, to support all of these social safety nets that we have in our nations, including
Mhm.
Social Security in the United States. So future generations are going to condemn us just as harshly as we look back in the 1800s and make judgments and condemn the founding fathers. And again, that's a very self-righteous thing to do. So Jefferson himself said this about slavery,
Mhm.
quote, he said, "We have a wolf by the ear and we can neither hold him or safely let him go." He came to realize that his generation didn't have the will to do it. So they would just have to hold the wolf by the ear until a next generation with a little more courage and determination would end slavery. He wrote, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just." And he made that statement connected to his fear that slavery would bring national judgment.
Mhm.
Sure enough, he was like a prophet. It did, called the Civil War. It did bring
Yeah,
national judgment, didn't
the
it?
most terrible war and the most casualties of all
Hmm.
wars combined. It truly was a curse that, again, was one of those things that really left a mark on our history, on our legacy, and a lesson from the divine.
Yeah, absolutely. So Jefferson wrote that he was concerned in his writings, he was very concerned about how abused and poverty ridden freed slaves were in his lifetime. It's because they lacked an education. So if you're uneducated and somebody de facto gives you your freedom, your liberty, but you can't support yourself, you're going to be taken advantage of every time you buy something. You're going to be used and manipulated. You're going to be underemployed. You are going to basically live on a starvation level of existence. And he saw all of that. He didn't think that that was a good thing to do. You know, I just mentioned that the first sovereign nation to abolish slavery was Haiti. Look how that's worked out for the last 222 years.
Right.
And here's the moral of the story. And Jefferson was like a prophet. Without universal education for a population, when you don't have people educated, they live by ignorance and superstition. It becomes a national curse. And democracy, the idea of liberty, only works in an educated and virtuous people who respect the rule of law. And he just didn't think de facto waving a magic wand and giving people freedom served them at all because they basically would be subjected to a life of poverty. And he didn't think that was a good thing. And think about what happened to the United States between the end of the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement. Isn't that exactly what happened to African descendants living in the South during the Jim Crow years? Yeah, technically they had their freedom,
Hmm.
but they were in abject poverty. They lacked opportunity for a good education. Most of them were underemployed, sharecroppers, barely subsistence living. Oh, yeah, technically they were free, but in reality they were still enslaved. And Jefferson saw all of this in advance. That's why he wanted gradual emancipation That's why he brought this issue out in the Declaration of Independence. That's why within Virginia, as a delegate, he tried to pass a law offering gradual emancipation. But in time, he hit so many roadblocks that he just gave up trying. Something else happened to him. He becomes an older man. And in time, he realizes that he's living well beyond his means. One thing about Jefferson that was a character flaw is he loved to live large. He loves importing French wines, fine French foods, even has one of his slaves learn French cooking so that he can eat French food.
Hmm.
He's constantly importing books from Europe. That isn't cheap
Yeah.
by ship coming in from Europe because he loves to read. He lived way beyond his means and he's going more and more into bankruptcy. And frankly, his plantation worked by slaves were his wealth, and what little security he had in his later years were because of them. Most of his slaves were mortgaged to his creditors by the end of his life,
Hmm.
which meant they were effectively part of his assets. And they were all sold off to settle his estate, except for five people. He did free all members of the Hemmings family, and we'll be talking about Sally
Yeah.
Hemings in a minute. He freed all five of the members of the Hemmings family, but they had skills beyond just being field hands and they could support themselves because they worked in and around Monticello rather than just being mere field hands. And they could literally support themselves. So he freed them. The rest of his slaves, unfortunately, were sold off to settle his estate because he did go into bankruptcy when he died.
One interesting thought is the question about slavery. I was in high school in the 1960s, 100
Mm-hmm,
years after the Civil War, and we spent an entire unit in what was called APES class, American Politics, Economics, and Sociology, discussing
mm-hmm,
the issue of slavery 100 years previously. Was it a moral issue or was it an economic issue? And we came to the point that it really was, as you pointed out and clearly here, it was an economic issue. It was something which was the underpinnings of the way the society was set up, right or wrong, but it was on that basis. As in some
mm-hmm.
ways, some of the immigration issues are set up on immigration. Was immigration questions are underlined by economic factor as well. So I think that this is a very interesting study in human conduct, morality, and ethics. Now that we're talking about, you brought up the name of Sally Hemings, another elephant in the room, some of the less, let's say, glorious sides of
Mm-hmm.
Thomas Jefferson. Another elephant in the room, do DNA tests absolutely prove that Thomas Jefferson fathered children to a slave servant named Sally Hemings?
Excellent question. And let me begin by saying it certainly is possible. Jefferson was a red-blooded American male. When he was ambassador to France, he fell in love with a woman named Maria. To his chagrin, she was a committed Catholic and would not have relationships. She was already married, would not have a relationship with him. But he obviously, if you look at his writings, he was deeply infatuated with this beautiful young woman. He wrote a famous letter about the head talking to the heart within himself. So he had normal urges like any healthy red blooded male. Sally Hemings, most people don't realize, was actually his wife's half sister.
Hmm.
So it was Martha's half sister. She was, according to writings, very light skinned. And who knows, to Jefferson, she may have looked a lot and reminded him of his wife. So I'm just saying it's certainly possible, and I'm not going to deny that. But I do want to focus on the results of a 1998 study who, interestingly enough, came out when we had an American president who was caught in the act of adultery and said, I did not have sex with that woman.
Mm-hmm.
And this study was released as a justification for this president's act of adultery. And it wasn't just an act of adultery, there was a power imbalance. He was, I believe, in his 40s. She was a young intern. By today's standards, he'd probably be in jail because of the power balance. So it was, he's president, she's a nobody, he's celebrity status, he has control over her. That was inexcusable at the time, but the American public allowed it to happen without repercussions on this man. And about this time, this 1998 study comes out. But what does the actual DNA show? Well, it shows that there is a Y chromosome match between a male line descendant of Eston Hemmings and the Jefferson male line. And here's what that proves. It proves that a Jefferson paternal line connection, but it doesn't specifically identify Thomas Jefferson. So because the Y DNA passes from father to son, this indicates that Eston's father belonged to the Jefferson paternal line. But Y DNA alone cannot distinguish between Thomas Jefferson and other Jefferson men who shared the same Y chromosome.
Mhm.
He had a brother. His brother's name was Randolph. Randolph had sons. One of his sons, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, for example, was reportedly at Monticello for extended schooling in 1799, 1800, 1801, which overlaps with the conception windows for Sally Hemings' early children, including Harriet and possibly others. Then there's a second son. Robert Louis Jefferson was placed at Monticello in August of 1807, and that overlaps with the conception window for Easton Hemings, so he could possibly be the father. And then there was Isham Jefferson, who's described as being, according to the sources, reared by Thomas Jefferson. And he would have been old enough to be at Monticello during the earlier conception years of Sally Hemings. And this is again through written sources, though they're less specific about the exact dates and stays and time he was there. So my point is, could Jefferson be the father of her children? Certainly, he could. He was a man. She was a beautiful woman. Does the DNA analysis prove that? Absolutely not. What it does prove is that they're on the paternal side of Jefferson. And by the way, he didn't have any sons himself, so it doesn't come directly. They had to go to another relative to draw that
Mhm.
paternal Y DNA to prove it. It shows that there is a connection between the Jefferson paternal line and Sally Hemings' son, but it does not prove of itself that Thomas Jefferson was the father of her children.
Well, this could be a program for unsolved mysteries.
Absolutely.
Two, 250 years later. Greg, what will we be covering next?
Vic, next time I would like to cover a man who was easygoing, whom everybody liked, who was also, like Thomas Jefferson, a Renaissance man with great gifts, inventive abilities, curiosity, and incredible political skills, none other than Benjamin Franklin.
I'm looking forward to that one because he is somewhat an anomaly. He is
Mhm.
kind of different, but the same, and a part of that group. Well, Greg, it's
The true self-made man,
he's
Ben Franklin.
he certainly was that, and I was wondering too if there was maybe a Sally Hemings in his life too. But anyway, Greg, it's just been great talking to you, reliving American history, especially at this historic time, the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So great to have you. This is probably our last program before the actual 4th, but we'll be continuing on after the 4th with continuation of our founding fathers.
Thank you, Vic, and I wish you and your audience an awesome 4th of July. It's something to truly be celebrated and something we should all appreciate the sacrifice of the founders and all that they did for us.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for listening to us today on the KUBIK Report. Please feel free to share this podcast with your friends. The KUBIK Report can now be found on ucg.radio, as well as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, as well as most places where you get your podcasts, as well as my website, KUBIK.org. Or simply go to any browser address bar and type in the KUBIK Report, and you'll instantly find us. Be sure to spell KUBIK, K-U-B-I-K. We would love to hear from you, your impressions, suggestions, and questions. Please write to vic@kubik.org. That's vic@kubik.org. So come back soon for more, and have a great day.